So this project has been funded by the Alcoa Foundation and also the Indiana Forestry and Woodland Owners Association that Liz is a part of. So I'm very thankful for those organizations who have made this work possible so far. Yeah, so I am a self-proclaimed bird nerd. I did my undergraduate in biology at Taylor University. I did my graduate work at Purdue University under Dr. Barney Dunning. I saw B was online. She was one of my lab mates, which was awesome. Yeah, I studied bird migration. So I looked at habitats that birds are using during their migration pathways and how people can really, and kind of the interaction between humans and birds, looking at what kind of habitats birds are using during migration and how humans can better manage our lands and help protect these wonderful species. I'm passionate about helping my neighbors, whether they're my next door neighbors or neighbors across the state, neighbors across the country, manage our shared world for the good of each other, as well as the creatures within that world. So the project I'm working on, we're calling it Forestry for the Birds. So it's inspired by a really similar project in Vermont. So I'd point you guys to that link there. Yeah, that's a really good kind of starting point. So it's a program designed to help Indiana forest landowners as well as professional foresters manage forest and woodland properties for birds. It's a really great tool that the Audubon Society in Vermont has helped kind of put together. And I'm excited that we're kind of putting one together for Indiana as well. So far, this is still a work in progress, but we've made really good progress so far. So we've selected a list of 12 target forest bird species. We did this in consultation with wildlife experts, with foresters, conservation agents, kind of people all across the state who are really involved in bird conservation. So we have found this list of bird species that are in need of targeted forest conservation action. Usually this means that the bird is declining, their populations are in trouble through a variety of different means. And these are birds that will benefit from having improved habitat, whether that's backyard habitat, state forest improvement, kind of the whole range. These birds can benefit. To kind of help make this goal a reality, we're developing a series of publications and different guides for people to use. So there will be a pocket guide that's geared towards landowners, the general public, any people like us who maybe own forest, want to help birds, things like that. So this will introduce all of our bird species and give you starting points for managing your properties for these birds. We're also putting together a guide for professional foresters so that in consultation with foresters, you all can help manage your lands for birds. I'll also be putting together a series of profiles for each of these species. So keep your eyes out in the Woodland Steward magazine newsletter. So they should be published in that. So I'll be putting together those profiles as well. So I'm really excited to share this list of bird species. This is what we've got so far. These species are across the whole range of forest habitat types. So if you're not a birder, that's okay. I can kind of introduce some of these birds. So we have the American woodcock. It's a game species. It's not hunted as much as it probably was historically, but it's a good game species. It lives in early successional forest. That kind of young forest habitat is also used widely by red-headed woodpeckers. In the middle there, yellow-billed cuckoo. Let's see who else. Yellow-billed chat is another early successional bird. Eastern towhee. We also have some mature forest birds. The cerulean warbler, this bright blue one here. We have the Baltimore oriole, hooded warbler, worm-eating warbler, and the wood thrush. Those are all mature forest birds. So you can help manage some of your older forests for those kind of bird species. And then we have a couple backyard birds, which I'm also very excited about. The eastern screech owl up here in the top right, and the Baltimore oriole. And I know we were talking about some orioles that are bird feeders earlier before we got started. Um, they're actually declining significantly. Habitat loss is a big part of that. Climate change, there's a lot of factors that contribute to bird population declines. And the Baltimore oriole can really benefit from forest management. So I'm excited to have, maybe some of these a little more cryptic species like the eastern whippoorwill, and as well as some of the really charismatic species like the red-headed woodpecker and the Baltimore oriole. So these are the birders dozen that we're hoping to really benefit from this program. As far as where we're at, this is still a work in progress. We're getting close to the end. We're working on the publications, so stay tuned. Hopefully this will be rolled out early next year. Our aim is to release it in conjunction with a conference for foresters and forest landowners. So keep your ears peeled for that. Yeah, so far we're just hoping to really benefit forests of a range of types. So from those young forests, like I mentioned, even regenerating clear cuts, all the way up to mature forests that maybe benefit from simple invasive removal. If we want to talk about specific forest management techniques, I'd be happy to take questions about that. As a disclaimer, I'm not a forester, so I am doing this work in conjunction with a team of professional foresters, as well as Alan Purcell, the Director of Forest Conservation with the Nature Conservancy. So that's kind of the team we've put together to really make this work a reality. So I'm excited to really bring this to fruition. Let's see what else do we have. So some things that we can talk about kind of in the meantime. This is beneficial for anyone. So whether you own a large piece of forest, whether you own a single tree in your backyard, these are actions that people can take to really benefit birds. And these actions really do make a difference. So habitat loss is one of the major reasons that birds are declining, but another very tangible reason birds are declining are domestic cats. So if you have a cat, keep it inside. That is, cats kill around 2 to 3 billion birds per year in North America. So this is actually the single most beneficial action you can take to help birds in your backyard and your property. During migration, it's also important to cut down on window collisions. So there's reflective stickers you can get that will cut down on window collisions. Windowalert.com also has a series of UV, it's kind of like a marker that you can mark your windows with, and that'll also cut down on window collisions. Turning off bright lights at night, they're unnecessary and they interact with migratory birds. Avoiding pesticides, planting native plants, removing invasives, these are all actions that really help improve your forest. So if you have a forest that is really good in terms of structure and you're managing it maybe for timber or something like that, planting some native shrubs underneath or avoiding using pesticides can really help kind of improve your forest just that little bit more. Even down to the coffee you drink can help birds. Shade grown coffee leaves the forest canopy on wintering habitats, so down in Central and South America. It leaves that forest canopy intact and provides habitat for birds. Most of this coffee is also fair trade and organic, so it also benefits the farmers as well. So drinking bird-friendly coffee can also help birds, which as a coffee lover, I very much appreciate. Yeah, so I think, we can open it up to maybe some questions. I think there were a few questions that came in, that came in online before the conference. So I don't know if we want to go through those.
Jessica, I'd like to open with a question if you don't mind. You've mentioned structure and early successional habitat. Could you talk a little bit about the various structures in the woods and the ways in which birds might use those?
Yes. All right. So, um, yeah, so we can talk about, so I mentioned, mature forest. So this is large trees, generally a closed canopy, you know, open spaces underneath. A lot of birds, maybe I'll go back to this. So maybe the whippoorwill, on the left there, they are insectivores. And so they will forage by flying. They fly around and catch insects in their beaks. So they really need open spaces to be able to forage in that. Um, Something like the cerulean warbler, that's another mature forest bird. It really depends on having structure to protect from predators and things like that, structure to hide and forage in. It's a canopy specialist, so it hangs out in the very tops of trees, and really needs a lot of closed canopy, but also canopy gaps that create areas of forage and areas for nest placement. Something like the worm-eating warbler really needs a lot of shrub density as protection from predators. So I mentioned regenerating clear cuts. So once you cut down a forest, you get all that shrub growth coming back. That structure provides a lot of protection from predators. If you've got native shrubs in there, they'll provide insect homes, so insect foraging. The worm-eating warbler, like its name implies, feeds on insects, and so it needs places to forage for those insects. For fruit eaters like the wood thrush and Baltimore oriole, there's a lot of fruit producing shrubs, so that kind of shrub density can really benefit birds like that. And then an open forest floor is also another piece of structure that can benefit different bird species. So I'm not sure if that exactly answered your question, but that's just an example of a few birds that use different structures within forest.
Thank you. We had a question from Tom P. He asked, this is a kind of a structure question. How important is it to keep some snags, dead trees for these birds?
Yes, snag retention is a great tool that you can use. So the red-headed woodpecker, the eastern screech owl, I think those are the two main ones on this list that we selected specifically to kind of target snag retention. Both of those birds nest in cavities, either cavities created by other birds, like the eastern screech owl nests in cavities that have been created by someone else. The red-headed woodpecker will create its own cavities, but it needs that dead wood to be able to make its nesting homes. So snag retention can really benefit specifically those two birds, but provide insect abundance for other insectivores. Perching habitats, the eastern towhee loves to sit right on the top of the tallest tree, which is often a snag, and sing its heart out. So different birds can really benefit from having snags in your woods. The other one I would mention is the hooded warbler. It tends to like down wood, so logs left on the ground. It likes to hop along and forage on dead wood on the ground. So either leaving tops, stumps, things like that can benefit hooded warbler as well.
So I think a take-home lesson from those comments is that as you're working in your woods or managing your woods, you might choose not to clean it like some people like to do, but to leave that down woody debris or those snags in the woods for the birds to use. And if you don't have any or many snags, some people will create them to create better habitat. So simply deadening a tree by girdling it, making a ring around it with a chainsaw or a hatchet will allow you to create some snags if that's something that you want to generate the bird activity. We had another question from Tom. He asked, I'm wanting to avoid pesticides in our woodlands, but invasive species sometimes require that. What is the balance to help birds?
Yeah, so it's kind of a trade-off, I guess. So when I think of pesticides, I think, spraying your crops or things like that, which has a place and a time. I think using unnecessary pesticides can, I know we often don't use unnecessary pesticides, but um, I know in my own woods, we've had a huge problem with honeysuckle. I think our woods haven't been touched in 40 years, and it, you can see on the left here, is just so overgrown. So what we've done is a cut stump treatment for honeysuckle. So we cut it down and then spray just the stump with concentrated Roundup or glyphosate. So that's a very targeted place for glyphosate. It prevents it from, harming other vegetation in the woods, while still creating this really nice habitat structure within our woods. You can see on the right. So I think everything in moderation is kind of my take home idea for using pesticides. If you need it, there is a time and a place, but follow manufacturer instructions. I know on lawn management, a lot of times even fertilizer, we tend to overuse. So making sure you're following the manufacturer instructions and not allowing, runoff from things like that. So it's kind of a rambling answer, but
That was a good answer. Yes, limiting your use is very important. Any of these species dependent on invasive plants like bush honeysuckle?
no. Some birds will use honeysuckle, specifically the berries. I know I've actually seen studies of birds, I think it was on cardinals, that in urban areas where there's a lot of honeysuckle will actually get redder because they're eating more of the honeysuckle berries. But it doesn't actually increase their fitness. I use the example, it's like feeding cake to a toddler. They might really like it, they might really enjoy it, but in the long term, it's not a good situation. It can really harm their fitness. Something like a flowering dogwood or other berry producing shrubs that are native, they tend to have more lipids, which birds really depend on for migratory fuel. Those are better in terms of providing good fuel for birds.
If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to put those in the chat box. In the meantime, I believe we got some questions in advance, and Jessica, I believe you have those at hand if you'd like to go ahead and answer.
Yeah, let me pull those up real fast. Yeah, so one question was, why are birds in decline and what can be done to help? So I know I kind of answered the last part of that question. So some of the reasons birds are in decline, this is just a list I've put together in past presentations. Habitat loss, climate change, domestic predators, collisions with buildings or windows, pesticide use. That study that I cited was specifically looking at neonicotinoid pesticides and its effect on bird reproduction. Policy changes and other factors really contribute to bird declines. But I like this slide because it shows, there's all these different reasons the birds are declining. They're in trouble. There's a major study that came out recently that we're missing about a third of all of our birds that we should have in North America. We've lost almost 30% of our birds, but conservation really does work. Management can really benefit birds. There's so many success stories. The Kirtland's warbler is one I always go back to. It's a small warbler that lives in the forests of northern Michigan. It migrates down to the Bahamas in the winter. It was on the endangered species list for decades. But better forest management, an improved fire regime, providing its preferred habitat has really improved that bird's chances, and it's now off the endangered species list. So good conservation, science-based management really does work. Just an anecdote, like I said, we've been working on this honeysuckle removal in our own woods. And just this spring, I have a pair of red-headed woodpeckers that are happily banging on the snags in our woods now. The open understory, I think, has drawn them back. So that's just an anecdote, but conservation really does work. That's why I'm so excited about this process.
We had a question from B. She says, for those of us who don't have land currently, what do you recommend is the best route we can go to influence conservation decisions for these species?
Yeah, at the risk of being controversial, voting is actually the most influential tool you have. So voting for leaders both on a very local scale as well as a national scale to follow science-based practices. That's probably the biggest influence you can have. Working with community centers, helping your local community, whether that's a community garden all the way up to, helping out with invasive removals on city parks or things like that. There's all kinds of ways you can get involved on, both a local up to a national scale. Get involved with organizations like the National Audubon Society, your local Audubon chapter. I'm obviously very biased, but the Nature Conservancy, organizations like that can have tools for you to really get involved, even if you don't have land of your own.
Thank you.
And while we're talking about invasive species, let me make a plug. If you aren't familiar with the local CISMAs, the County Invasive Management Areas, those are county units all over the state, and many of them are quite new and just being developed. But those are groups that are working to attack invasive species in each county. And they provide work days, and those work days can be useful to help learn about how to control invasive species. So if you'll volunteer for your local county group, you may have opportunities to learn more about invasive species control so that you can go back to your own property and do it, as well as they have work days to do control on public lands. And I'll put a link in the website or on the chat for you on how to connect with some of those county CISMAs. Jessica, do you have another question in hand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another question was ways to help birds other than bird seed. I think I already kind of touched on that. So how to create an environment which richly sustains wildlife. So that's a very good question. I would say it depends on what wildlife species you're targeting. However, if you want to help wildlife across a wide range of groups, maybe you want to help all 12 birds on our list, which is awesome. The best thing you can do is create a diversity in your property, a diversity of structures, a diversity of tree species, a diversity of habitat types, we'll say. Even for some of our mature forest birds, I'll go back to my list here. The cerulean warbler needs a mature forest, but it needs canopy gaps. The wood thrush is less picky and it just needs mature forest. And then you kind of follow the spectrum all the way down to the American woodcock, which really likes young forest and open, almost prairie-like areas. It does this really cool display during mating season where it goes out into open clearings, flies hundreds of feet into the air, and then kind of spirals down while it's calling the whole time. It's a really fascinating display. But it needs wide open areas for that. So creating a diversity of habitats can really benefit a diversity of wildlife. Um, there's a scientific explanation for that, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, if you want to get really nerdy about it. But yeah, species tend to like a diversity of areas. You don't want monocultures, you don't want, um, one single habitat type. If you have the options to create a diversity, I'd say that's the best way to richly sustain a lot of wildlife.
Jason asked, is there any field work and research needed to inform the management decisions and any technologies used to understand the diet, behavior, etc.?
Could you repeat the question?
There were two. I'll just do one at a time. Is there any field work and research needed to inform the management decisions?
That is a good question. I am. I would have to get back to you on that. I'm not positive the areas that have been researched fully and areas that are still in need of research. Yeah, I would have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, I know the hardwood ecosystem experiment is a 100-year experiment over many thousands of acres in South Central Indiana. It's a partnership between about 6 universities and the DNR. And in that, they're doing a variety of forest management practices and controls, and then evaluating how all types of animals, including birds, are using the habitat. And they've had quite a few interesting outcomes from that. Places where say mature forest species were actually using openings and clear cuts quite a bit more than they expected for a variety of reasons. So that's some of the information or some of the work that's been going on and is pretty new. They found some good things with bats as well in the same regard. The second question was, are any technologies used to understand the diet, behavior, etc.?
Yeah. Guessing we're talking about birds still specifically. So yeah, I know historically mist netting and doing, stomach contents and things like that can help inform diet studies. Yeah, I think going off of what Liz was saying, the hardwood ecosystem experiment has been a really great tool that's helped inform a lot of research. So the one that comes to mind specifically is the worm-eating warbler. I know that was research, I'm again biased, that came out of my lab in graduate school, Barney Dunning's lab. I wasn't involved with the research personally, but they found that worm-eating warblers, which are traditionally a mature forest bird, actually both through mist netting and doing, mist netting in regenerating clear cuts, as well as stable isotope analysis, which is a lot more chemistry based. Both of those analyses types kind of helped inform that, hey, these worm-eating warblers are actually using regenerating clear cuts during the post-fledging phase of their life. So times when they really need a lot of fuel, a lot of protection from predators, they're using these areas with more intense structure. So more shrub density, things like that. So different fuel types during different phases of life. So maybe during the breeding season, they're in the mature forest where they can find a lot of, maybe their typical protein-rich foods like worms and caterpillars. And then during the post-fledging phase, moving towards migration, they move out into some of these shrub areas where they get a lot more berries, which are rich in lipids and things like that for migration. So that's just one example of some research that's been done on different habitat use, different fuel types, things like that. So.
Thanks. Could you speak a little bit about water? I know they have water needs, as all wildlife do. Are there ways that what are their needs there, and are there ways that landowners can provide water to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So most of these species we tried to stay away from species that are riparian or river edge dependent. The yellow-billed cuckoo, I will say, really likes areas along creeks, along rivers. So if you have that, that's great. But if you don't have a lot of water available, another way you can do that is putting out a bird bath. In general, I think a lot of birds are able to find their water sources, whether that's through the berries they eat, things like that. But putting out a bird bath would be my first thought. I think if you have access to water, even if it's spring ephemeral ponds, things like that can provide insect breeding grounds, since a lot of insects, their larval stages are in aquatic systems. You tend to get more insects around water. So if you can kind of foster that, that's great. But yeah, we tried for this list of birds specifically, we tried to stay away from ones that really depend on water.
Yeah, since the goal of this program was to recognize and define forest management that would be beneficial to birds, I know your focus wasn't on wetland birds and prairie and grassland birds, although they have needs as well. Did you have any more questions that came in advance? If anybody has any additional questions, we'd be happy to take those in the chat box.
I think we've addressed the ones that came in via chat. So unless there was one I missed.
Okay, any other questions? I'm really excited to see this project move forward. As a forester, I recognize the benefits that we have in forest management to help these birds, but defining specifically how we can help them for different species has not been an area that has been investigated very much. So it's going to be pretty neat to see this move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think kind of in conclusion, if anyone wants more information about birds, there's a whole suite of apps that I always recommend. Most of these are free. If you want to get really into birding, the Sibley guide it's a little pricey, but it's worth the cost. Otherwise, the Merlin Bird ID app is great if you're not a birder. It's a really great start to help you identify different things. So I'd recommend those apps. If you're interested in learning more about any of our target species, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is a great starting place. Allaboutbirds.org. I highly recommend them. You can find information on how to identify them, on their life history, what kind of habitats they use. So if you want to get a jump start on managing your lands for our 12 species, I would start there. And any additional sources and resources, I know some have been mentioned in the chat. I'll just leave you guys with this slide. So getting involved with different places like that.